All right, we'll get started. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for today's important webinar, Trapped in Tradition, Forced Marriage as a Form of Human Trafficking. My name is Sumay Mahmood, and I'm the Anti-Human Trafficking Program Coordinator here at Sakeenah. We would like to begin by acknowledging that while Sakeenah functions at a national level, our head office and the People's Market operate out of land that is part of the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Wyandot nations. Sakeenah believes that while a land acknowledgement is the first step, we also understand that land acknowledgements alone are not sufficient to redress the harm caused by centuries of land theft, forced displacement, and ongoing acts of settler colonialism. We recognize that this work is ongoing and complex, and we are dedicated to doing our part to create a better future for all. Forced marriage, often disguised as tradition or cultural expectation, is clouded by misconceptions, making it difficult to recognize its devastating consequences and its connection to human trafficking. Today, we aim to shed light on this issue, foster understanding, and empower our communities with tools to combat this exploitation. We are fortunate to have a knowledgeable panel with us whose insights will deepen our understanding and inspire actionable steps to protect individuals and support those who are impacted by this injustice. And this brings us to our keynote speaker today. I'm honored to introduce Deepa Mattu. Deepa is an accomplished lawyer and an intersectional feminist committed to equity, anti-oppression, and anti-racism. As executive director of the Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic since 2019, she has led advocacy efforts and overseen multiple departments. Deepa has appeared before the Supreme Court of Canada, parliamentary committees, and UN civil society meetings, championing social justice and human rights. She trains service providers to support forced marriage survivors and racialized non-status women, and has taught as an adjunct professor at Osgoode Hall Law School since 2017. Her numerous accolades include the Law Society Medal, the Ontario Bar Association Award for Excellence in the Promotion of Women's Equality, and an honorary degree from Humber College. Thank you again, Deepa, for joining us today. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sumaya. Thank you to everyone who's responsible for organizing this conversation today. And I'm really honored to be among all the dignitaries and speakers, as well as the audience. I am joining you from Oakville, which is part of the same land acknowledgement as Sumaya did. It is a land which has been stewarded by the Mississaugas of the Credit Nations for generations altogether. The clinic is located in Takaranto, so Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic has been in existence for many years. So very briefly about the history of the clinic. The Barbara Schleifer Clinic is named after a woman, Barbara Schleifer, who unfortunately was killed on the night of her call to the bar ceremony. She was an idealistic lawyer, wanted to work in the area of gender-based violence and feminist practice, and her friends, after her death, decided to open a clinic in 1985 in her name to remember her, to create a legacy in her name, and that's what the clinic is all about. We provide multiple and wraparound services under this banner and have been in existence since 1985. Next year, we will be celebrating our 40 years of existence. The clinic's mission is to provide trauma-informed legal services, counseling, and multilingual interpretation, and we drive system transformation to support women and gender-diverse people. We are rooted in the foundations of intersectionality, innovation, and client-centered approach. We foster the skills and resilience of the people we serve, and we amplify their voices to create individual and collective change. The clinic's 3-year vision includes continuing to provide the legal help and counseling and interpretation, but at the same time, we want to work with and collaborate with our partners to reform laws and restructure institutions for more accessible and inclusive services. The clinic also aims to meet the needs of the community through client-centered services, innovation and evaluation, and evidence-based approach. And we want to work with our local and worldwide partners to address new needs and mobilize collective action. The clinic has a UN ECOSOC status for not-for-profits, which also allows us to do advocacy at the international stage, engaging with a lot of international instruments. We are really happy to be doing this work alongside partners all over the world. Usually I start any presentation about the work that the clinic does, as well as the issue like a forced marriage, with a visual like this, which kind of speaks to the intersectionality and the reality that gender-based violence is a very complex, layered, and complicated issue. It is rooted in racism, colonialism, sexism, and a lot of gender-based violence, misogyny, and patriarchy. It is not necessarily one form of violence, but various forms of violence, and we'll unpack that today. Forced marriage is a form of violence. And why do I say that it is a form of violence? Because it includes mechanics of two things: mechanics of fraudulent inducement, violence, which could be physical abuse, psychological or emotional manipulation, that leads to the violence that can be emotional, mental, or physical. When you find someone stuck in a situation of either being forced into a marriage or in a forced marriage, it usually has a precursor to it, which leads to the situation. So therefore, there are two stages of mechanics in any forced marriage situation. One thing that I always talk about, and I know that at this time and age, probably, most of the people in the room would understand this, that arranged marriage and forced marriage is not the same thing. Unfortunately, we can't have this conversation without talking about it, because lots of mainstream way of talking about it, others the issue, and in many situations we see that these two concepts are conflated. So it's really important to understand that these are two polar opposite concepts. They're not at all overlapping at any point. But one thing which is worth noting is that a situation that might start as a pure arranged marriage situation, at some point, if the coercion enters that conversation, it can convert into a forced marriage situation. So basically, the consent from a marriage, if withdrawn at any stage of the marriage, means that that marriage is not valid. We understand this concept very clearly. It is rooted in our cultures and in our traditions and in our religions very clearly. But unfortunately, in the practical reality of it, people do not understand. Sometimes to make it light and for people to understand it, I say that arranged marriage is a situation where our families come together and do a background check of the person, which is better than hiring a personal investigator against a person, because you will check the background and the generations. And whereas forced marriage is a marriage where the people, even if the background is similar, they are not necessarily fully consenting to the marriage. So the difference is stark. And although it seems very repetitive for many of us when we enter these conversations, it is really important to create the distinction every time we talk about it. Now, human trafficking, on the other hand, is a crime, as we all understand, which impacts people across the globe. There are millions of women and girls that live in the long shadows of human trafficking, whether it is because of a forced coercion or deception. Sometimes they live in limbo, in fear, and in pain. Because human trafficking operates in darkness, it is sometimes very difficult to give exact numbers of people who are living in trafficking situations, or people, women and girls who are victims of trafficking. How are these two things intersecting is something important, and this visual of the road kind of talks about, there is a movement which happens in a marriage, which can lead to a traffic condition. So forced marriage, if we have to define it, there are many definitions out there, but if we have to define it in simple words, is a marriage which occurs where one or both parties are married without their free and full consent, often due to physical and emotional abuse, threats, fraud, or deception, there is lack of consent that differentiates the forced marriage from arranged marriage, as we just discussed. How does it intersect with human trafficking? This is when the forced marriage is considered a form of human trafficking when it involves elements of exploitation, such as forced labor or sexual exploitation. Human trafficking involves force, fraud, or coercion or exploitation. Again, although it's very hard to find the numbers, but ILO's numbers from 2016 say that there were around 15.4 million people who were living in forced marriages. Women and girls are obviously disproportionately affected by this. A lot of people, when they think about forced marriages and human trafficking, they always think about that human trafficking is something that impacts a lot of people who are, maybe minors or people who don't have capacity to make a decision. Whereas human trafficking happens to a lot of people because they are trying to be somewhere, so they're trying to get smuggled into a country, or they're trying to work in a situation where they're not necessarily happy, but they want to, remain in those situations. So those are a common understanding of these two situations of violence, and both are violence. That's pretty clear, whether it's forced marriage or trafficking. But something worth noting is that both often involve elements of trafficking, such as coercion, fraud, and exploitation, where victims are frequently subjected to physical and emotional abuse, and where the movement of the person happens in the deception of the marriage. Now, unfortunately, once that happens, it usually follows with exploitation as well as domestic servitude. This aligns with the broader definition of human trafficking, which includes exploitation through force, fraud, or coercion. Looking at some other statistics that we have noted, which are more recent than 2016 stats that I shared earlier. In ILO's 2021 stats talk about there are 50 million people living in modern slavery, and there are 22 million people trapped in forced marriages. UNODC, which is the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, they have reported that 14% of detected trafficking victims are trafficked for marriage. Women and girls are disproportionately affected. Of course, 68% of all forced marriage victims are women and girls. When we look at the local statistics, in Canada, forced marriage is recognized as a form of human trafficking. And the 2024 Trafficking in Persons report highlighted the forced marriage can increase vulnerability for future exploitation and abuse. And Ontario has specific legal protection and support services for victims of forced marriages. But the challenge remains in the enforcement and the awareness of the issue. So what are the common challenges for support? They're related to the communication. So a lot of survivors are not necessarily people from English as their first language. But even if they speak English as their second language, sometimes they don't have the right kind of expression to speak about their experience. Or they believe that what has happened to them is normal, this is what their fate is, or they believe that there is no help available. So we see communication barrier going hand in hand with the lack of information for a lot of survivors. Access to justice for survivors of human trafficking and forced marriage means that sometimes the community, at times people they love, at times people who are back home, would be facing criminalization. That criminalization piece stops a lot of survivors from coming forward. A lot of survivors want to get help. They want the violence and the abuse in their life to stop, but they don't want the community members from their community or their loved ones to get criminalized. And that definitely creates a huge barrier for a lot of survivors to come forward and access justice system. Discrimination, I think in the system, in spite of there is a lot of awareness and there's a lot of education out there, there is a huge discrimination against specific communities, and there's homogenization of the communities when it comes to the practices of forced marriage, and especially its intersection with the human trafficking. First of all, a lot of these situations are not understood to be the situation of human trafficking. And in other situations where they are understood to be the situation of human trafficking, the understanding of the forced marriage is lacking. So we see a lot of times witnesses come forward, not supported or homogenized and othered. Fear of consequences. So I mentioned that there are families abroad, there is connections abroad in a lot of these situations, and survivors and witnesses coming forward do fear the consequences of those situations for themselves, their loved ones, and also their own future in this country. So what are the trauma and the social barriers? Some of the traumas and the social barriers that we see for the survivors are rooted in cultural factors. So there are patriarchal beliefs and control over women's sexuality that we see as one of the factors. We see economic factors related to poverty, dowry, and bride price traditions. We also see social factors which are related to family reputation, relationships, and immigration status. And none of the situation that I have dealt with in last 20 years, I would say there was one factor alone working out. It's usually a mix of cultural, economic, social, and systemic barriers and systemic challenges that survivors are facing. Who are the stakeholders who we need to engage in when it comes to the forced marriage situation and human trafficking situation? It's justice and the global affairs. These are two departments that are responsible for the enforcement piece, but also global affairs in case of the situation of trafficking and forced marriage to bring people back if they're stuck abroad. Health is a huge stakeholder. Unfortunately, what we see is that a lot of health service providers don't have the right screening tools to screen the situations of forced marriage and trafficking intersection. Education system. A lot of young people experiencing this violence are in our education system, and our education partners are not necessarily trained on screening the risk and providing appropriate support. Immigration and housing. I think the housing crisis is pretty well understood by most of the people. But when it comes to the immigration, I think what is less understood is that a lot of time this movement of people through trafficking is happening with immigration channels. Canada is a very interesting country geographically. A lot of movement that happens in Canada does not happen on land borders. It happens when someone lands in this country. And usually people land in this country with some kind of legitimate paperwork. A lot of the situations of forced marriage where trafficking is involves someone landing here as a sponsored spouse or sponsored conjugal partner. A lot of these people, when they are here, they are then put into labor conditions, which are also exploitative, and they find it really hard to get help because their immigration status, being in limbo or dependent, makes them feel that they don't have any power in the relationship to do something about their situation. Housing, I said, is a crisis, and we very well understand that if a survivor doesn't have a safe space to live, it's really hard for them to take a decision of leaving. In terms of the legal framework, there are 4 legal frameworks that I would suggest get involved when someone comes forward. Immigration law, as I gave the example, when a woman comes here and she has a dependent visa, whether it's a spousal visa or it is a work visa, she has immigration law engaged in the process, and she needs to navigate her safety while deciding her, leaving the situation or taking an exit plan, thinking about how would her immigration status get implicated. Sometimes it's not only her own immigration status, it's the immigration status of the entire family. So in case of the asylum seekers, survivors who are in forced marriage or trafficked conditions, they have responsibility of not only their own status, but the status of the entire family on their shoulders. Family law obviously gets engaged in a lot of these situations, especially in the post-traumatic situations where the trauma is obviously behind, the marriage has already happened, and it's post marriage situation. So basically, aftermath of the violence, in which the family law gets engaged in most of these situations. Repatriation is the cases where you will work with clients who you would try to bring back into the country who have been stuck abroad, and criminal law and civil law, depending on what route you take to make a complaint or not, or make a civil law claim to get some compensation for the crimes that have happened against you. who are the people who need to be involved in tackling these situations? So I think there is a role of community and the dialogue around the culturalization that happens a lot. So I personally have always fought this whole notion that there is that the violence has something to do with the culture. In my understanding, the culture of the violence is one thing, which is the violence itself. So that whole dialogue of the culturalization needs to be fought, and the way to argue back or fight back on these two pieces from the community's role is to engage in education and training and awareness. Maybe a conversation like today is where that kind of dialogue belongs. So that's part of the framework of tackling these situations. There is bias and there is profiling. Most definitely in the case of forced marriages and trafficking intersection, we see that there is a bias and there is profiling of the certain communities. So how do we fight back against that? We need to look at the screening mechanisms. We need to look at the risk assessments that are engaged in these situations. And we need to also work together to expand the definitions, where we can actually educate people on how to differentiate it with actual real traditions versus definitions which are misappropriately used. At the policy level, we need institutional commitments. We need institutional commitments at all levels, whether it is an organization like, say, for example, Schleifer Clinic, which needs to have a policy in place to support survivors of gender-based violence, which should include trafficking and forced marriage at all times. But we need larger institutional commitment. One of the lacking commitment that we see in the system is that a lot of police officers are not really trained on this intersection really well. So when a survivor thinks of getting help and she approaches a police officer or an enforcement officer, if that person is not really trained and they don't have the institutional commitment, she could fall into the tropes of bias and profiling and not get helped, rather discriminated against. And being client-centric, which means that all legal options, support, counseling, any conversation should start with the clients at the center of it. So people with the lived experience and their voices are really, really important in this conversation. And we should always center our conversation around their experiences. So how can we better support? We can make sure that there is empowerment of survivors through counseling. We are offering holistic support for better outcomes. We are creating participation and comprehension at all stages, strategies for survivors, because I have to tell you that I've met many people who have been through these experiences, but they don't necessarily identify themselves as that I'm a victim, I'm a survivor, I went through a forced marriage. That's not their language. That's the language and the construct that we put together for better understanding of the experiences. So it's really important that we create environment for participation and comprehension at all stages. It is important that we promote healing, which is tailored to the individual needs. We need to remember that healing is possible and reconstruction of people's lives and identities is possible through these rough experiences. So there is something which is called post-traumatic growth that can happen for a lot of individuals having gone through these experiences. We need to increase access to support services. And lastly, we need to enhance chances of our better legal outcomes. In the current environment, the legal outcomes are not necessarily as positive. There's lack of understanding in the system. And we can hope that there are better legal outcomes and there's better options available for survivors in future. I would end my keynote part of the conversation right now. I want to thank all of you for listening to me. And I think we'll go into a panel and I'll be very happy to engage with questions and answers right now or later as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Deepa, for that inspiring and thought-provoking keynote. Your expertise and passion shed light on the complexes of forced marriage as a form of human trafficking, giving us a lot to reflect on, and then also setting the stage for our panel discussion that's coming up now, where I'd like to now introduce our next two panelists who also bring diverse perspectives and expertise to this conversation. So first we have Dr. Hamid Slimi. Dr. Slimi is an esteemed educator, scholar, and community leader with over 29 years of experience as an imam, chaplain, and counselor in North America. He serves as a chairman professor at the Canadian Centre for Deen Studies, training future imams and chaplains. Dr. Salimi is also the founder and resident scholar at Sayyidah Khadija Center in Mississauga and president of Faith of Life Network, a charitable organization focused on education and interfaith harmony. Recognized as one of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world by Georgetown University, he is a prolific author, lecturer, and consultant on Islamic studies, comparative religions, and community development. Joining us as well is Hina Mirza. Hina is a registered psychotherapist with over 20 years of experience as a writer, public speaker, and mental health educator. Holding a master's in counseling psychology with a focus on Islamic counseling, she specializes in supporting individuals and couples through emotional, behavioral, and relationship challenges. Hina is dedicated to fostering positive change through culturally sensitive, values-based therapy tailored to individual needs. Our moderator for the panel discussion is Leila Al-Fadli. Leila joined Sakeenah as a Pathi Foundation Fellow and founder of the Anti-Human Trafficking of Muslim Women Task Force. Today, she serves as the Anti-Human Trafficking Facilitator and Program Assistant at Sakeenah. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. I will pass on the virtual microphone to Leila.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Samaya. Okay, I'll go ahead and jump right into it. I'm actually going to start with Deepa because I guess I'm sorry to give you a break, but from a legal standpoint, what are the key protections available to individuals facing forced marriages in Canada?
So many years ago, it's been a few years now, in Canada, we had a very horrific titled bill. It was called the Zero Tolerance to Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, Bill S7. So the title was really, really horrific, and a lot of us opposed the bill just because of how it was constructed, and obviously a very stigmatizing language that was used in the bill. But as a lawyer, I see my role as an activist lawyer to criticize when the criticism is required and then see what did we get out of it. So what that bill did was it proposed a few changes in law, including making forced marriage as a crime on the books in the criminal code. So in Canada, forced marriage is a crime, and which means that if someone is being forced into a marriage without their free consent, it can be reported. The practical implication of that is that that doesn't necessarily mean that people will get help because there is lack of education of that particular area of work and change in the criminal code. But nevertheless, it stands on the books, and it is one of the tools in the toolbox. Within the same bill, there were several other changes that were brought forward. One of the good changes, the change that we actually welcomed, was within the Civil Marriage Act, which raised the age of marriage to 16. Now, if you think about it and look around globally, in most of the countries where there is a minimum age of marriage, it's actually 18, but Canada chose to pick 16 because, we have a federal system. Every province gets to decide the age of majority differently. So 16 is the minimum age of marriage. So that's another good change because, or I would say the only good change, I should say, because it actually gave a structure for the consent to the marriage. What was happening before that was, I will not go there because it was very confusing how people could be getting married and who could consent for people. There is also protection orders within that scheme that is available, which is filing for peace bonds. People can file for peace bonds against someone who is forcing them into a marriage, which is available. It's very difficult to get it, but it is available. Again, one thing is what is available and one thing is what you can access. So don't ask me, can we access it freely? Because that would potentially not happen. But is it available? Yes, it is available. And then there are other services that are available, which I think is probably the biggest solution available, which is that there are organizations like Schleifer Clinic, there are organizations like Post Marriage Project, there are places like settlement agencies who work with the communities, and they're very well trained and they understand these issues and they will provide supports and find the proper legal path. So those are the protections I would say that are actually working on the ground. rather than the legal provisions and law that are available, because unfortunately, we don't have the structures in place. It was more of a window dressing, for the lack of a better word, than the change in the law.
Thank you so much, Deepa, for the insight and appreciate your advocacy work in this field. So thank you. Hina, I'll jump to you. From a psychological perspective, forced marriage often leaves deep emotional scars. Can you speak of the short and long-term psychological effect of forced marriages on survivors?
Alaikum everyone, and good evening. Thank you, Layla. I wanted to first give a shout out to Sakeenah Canada for actually putting this together, because a lot of us sit here from a place of privilege thinking that this isn't an our community problem. Like, we always think of this whole concept of forced marriage or human trafficking as something that's far away from us. And so I'm glad to see that there are people here, and I really, really hope that you'll take the message beyond the conversation that we're having today with each other, because it's such an important topic that often goes right below the radar. And something that Deepa actually mentioned, which I'm so glad, like when she was talking about it, I was like applauding her from behind the scenes, that we've actually made this culturally acceptable, especially for those of us who come from the subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, a lot of countries where it's actually culturally acceptable because it's masked as arranged marriage. And so you'll be surprised how many women will come into an arrangement of being human trafficked into North America for the sake of working labor jobs, hard hours to bring money in so that the families are supported, and simultaneously sexually exploited as well. And they don't even realize it. So Deepa, thank you for pointing that out, because I think a lot of people don't realize it. We actually are under the impression that, oh, it's just a poor married situation, or it's just a bad marriage that the woman is in, when actually we just don't know how to label it correctly. And this is important for us as individuals in the communities to start labeling things properly and saying, okay, well, these are the implications. You brought up the question, what are the psychological impacts? Now, I mean, needless to say, I think all of us understand how deeply rooted the pain is when it comes to being exploited, especially when it's coming from a place of trust. And when I was given the topic, I was thinking about this, and I was like, the clients that I'm thinking of, or the women that I'm thinking of, actually come into this from the people they've trusted. They've been relationships that they trusted to take care of them and to, hand them into marriage to a responsible person who's going to love them and take care of them. And they agreeably signed on papers to say, this is going to make my life so much better. And then they find themselves in these painful situations. So immediately you can understand that the trauma and the shock of what happened. This was supposed to be my happily ever after. What happened? And then there's this deep-seated fear that you'll see settling in, where women are, and we talk mostly about women because that's where the majority of our research and information is, that they're afraid. I can't speak up because who's going to listen? And first of all, let's just be clear that, this conversation could go on for a while. They don't even have access to phones, ability to be in touch with their family members. So when they are here, they're actually quite isolated. So shock, anxiety, fear, then there is a lot of depression and helplessness, that there's nothing I can do. I guess I'm stuck here for the rest of my life. One of the reasons why this actually happens in our communities is because there's this falsified image of, this is what marriage is. It's servitude. Good women serve their families, and this is what you're supposed to do, and this is what's right. So especially, and you'll notice that the age bracket, I think Deepa can speak more to that, they're very young. So in certain cases, women are very, very young. So these girls essentially are in a marriage thinking, well, this is what I'm supposed to do. This is what is right. And if I do this enough, if I work 12 hours, and if I perform sexually, and if I make everybody happy around me, then my life will get better. So there's this constant carrot and stick idea that if I do everything, it's going to get better. And then there's a lot of guilt and shame, because in human trafficking, especially when it comes to forced marriages, the conversation doesn't just end at, you get here and we put you on a work schedule. You're being exploited and abused verbally, psychologically, physically, So there's a lot of this guilt and shame. I must have done something, you know, if I was better, then maybe my relationship would get better, and a lot of onus and ownership. And then, of course, the early onset of PTSD. PTSD won't really sink in until the long-term effects of it actually they start coming in. But the early symptoms of trauma and the disorders associated with trauma. There's a lot of spiritual abuse here as well. I speak on behalf of the Muslim community, and again, I know Imam Salimi is going to touch on that as well. You know, don't say anything, pray it away, make dua, everything will get better. And so a lot of that turns into spiritual abuse. So there's a lot of that short term, but then after the short term, you've passed that short term phase, long term, you'll see a lot of chronic depression, women who are just in this brain fog, thinking this is supposed to be normal. This is what's supposed to be, life is supposed to be like, I guess this is what I've been dealt. And then you'll hear a lot of women in this situation speaking to the akhirah element, that I will be rewarded at one point in my afterlife. And so I'll take this, I'll take the pain, and I'll take the abuse. And then, of course, in the long term, you have actual PTSD, because no matter how limited or how complex it was, there will be trauma symptoms that will need to be dealt with. Then, of course, you'll have lots of women who, even when they leave the situation, after they have left the abusive situation and they're no longer in this forced marriage situation, they're not going to have, it's not easy for them to get remarried and build new relationships. We're talking about lifelong pain. If any of you guys have ever seen a Bollywood movie or a Hollywood movie about human trafficking, where women reclaimed their lives and they became these beautiful, you know, empowered individuals, that's a bit glorified. You know, yes, there is healing. Yes, there is recovery, but this is lifelong pain. You don't, you know, by the end credits, you don't walk away feeling that you've owned the world because you've achieved, you know, you've left a painfully harmful situation. You're going to live with this for the rest of your life, especially for women who choose to get remarried and establish a new home. They're going to have a lot of complications with trust, intimacy, connection, communication, so just all future relationships. Then, of course, you've got cultural and identity crisis. It's really difficult to come from a culture where you were almost coaxed into making this decision, or it was kind of, you know, told that this is going to be an amazing experience, and then it turning out the way that it did. You have a very hard time trusting your own identity. Lots and lots of people will experience physical health issues as well. This is a very common thing that I think everybody here who's ever experienced any form of anxiety can testify to this, that mental health issues eventually manifest as physical health issues. So anytime you have any individual going through any form of mental abuse or mental strain or mental stress, eventually your body's going to catch up and it's going to become a physical health issue. And lastly, I just want to leave it at this, as the psychological effects, that this is going to break the person. Your self-esteem, the way you view yourself, the way that you view in your own inner world, your abilities, your capacities. And the thing about the human spirit is that once it's broken, it's never the same. Yeah, of course, with help, you know, support, and mashallah, like Deepa mentioned, so many community resources, you're able to come back. And I don't want to paint it with a broad brush of doom and gloom that, oh, well, everything is over. It's not like that. But I do want everybody to understand that it's not as simple as it might seem upfront. So with the work, with the right support, right resources, and the right kind of therapy, there is hope. And of course, you know, when we look at it from a community perspective, everybody who is at the forefront of this is willing to provide the help and support. But everybody who is part of the community needs to understand that there's not a delete button that you hit on trauma and move forward. It's something that you have to learn to grow with, and an experience that's going to leave you a changed person forever.
Thank you, Hina, so much to unpack there, from autonomy and mental and physical well-being. But I think both you and Deepa did mention a lot of like culture and spiritual abuse. So I'll transition to Dr. Salimi. Islam is often referenced in conversations about forced marriages, or it's used as a tool to justify forced marriage. What guidance does the Islamic teaching provide on this issue?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and I commend Sakeenah for holding this session today. She's very informative. I say first, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. I understand this is a panel, so I won't give the lecture, but I'll focus on two major points, probably to contribute somehow at framing this discussion into the real reason or the real problem. But let me add my voice, having done counseling for almost 30 years or plus, especially marriage counseling. Forced marriages are real, are happening remotely, by proxy, and even here in Canada, unfortunately. It's not restricted to the Muslim community, but unfortunately, this is a fact. What we call, modern slavery is happening. Unfortunately, the media likes to focus on Islam because Islam is always, the one to blame. The issue of forced marriages is seen through two different lenses. I want us to look at it through two different lenses: Islam as a religion and Muslim cultures that Muslims have adopted in different parts of the world. They're not necessarily the religion of Islam. As far as the religion is concerned, and when we say the religion, what was revealed, the Holy Quran and the teachings of Prophet, peace be upon him, and the laws, that would include what Muslim laws, the genius and the erudite scholars have come to conclude, and I'll close with that later. It is not acceptable. Forced marriages are null and void. But unfortunately, Muslim cultures may accept them, not because of the religion, but for different considerations. Could be family interests, as it was alluded to earlier, and inherited practices that survived even after Islam. Not only forced marriages, caste system, early marriage, racism, and ethnocentrism. These are some of the problems we could discuss because of the marriage, but the religion of Islam accommodates diverse cultural practices as long as they do not contradict the principles and values of what was revealed in the Islamic law and its objectives. And one of the objectives or the objectives of Islamic law is to protect life in all its aspects, as we know, the necessary things, the individual, the society, the property, the intellect, life in general. Forced marriages are practices that violate the sanctity of marriage in Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the context of marriage, I do marriages every week, at least a couple of them. Tomorrow I'll do, inshallah, marriage, although it's weekday. That's how often I do marriage. And one of my practices as an imam, as a marriage officiant, I always, and people look at me, especially South Asian brothers and sisters who are not used to this kind of nikah. First thing I do, 3 times I ask the bride, are you here today by your free will and free choice? And she would say, yes. I say, I need to hear you loud and clear. Are you being forced by people, including your parents or anyone present or absent, into this marriage? She says, no. Then I say the third question, do you know very well your rights and duties as a Muslim wife? And I would do the same thing with the groom. You can come to my weddings. This is my brand. Now, some imams started doing this because I would say at the same wedding, I would have walked out had I even smelled, this much of forced marriages, because Islam is clear. Islam actually stood against it. So these violate the sanctity of marriage. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called it mithaqan ghalida. It's a holy, solemn covenant. And you can describe such thing, which is the necessary thing is the agreement of the two, where they found peace in each other, as you know the verses. We're not going to get into all the Quran and the Hadith. And deep inside there is duress and constraint. So Islam, as Surah number 4, verse 21, you can refer to it, clearly describes marriage as a holy sanctity, holier than the holy Kaaba, is always repeat. So the purpose of marriage is to create that holy matrimony that leads to peace and affection, all of that. So how could we expect that in a forced marriage? So I'm going to sum up the issue in two things. So in order for an Islamic marriage to be valid, it has to meet certain criteria. Just two. There are many criteria, but these are two. Number one, the consent of both potential spouses is required. So a marriage of mutual consent and understanding is the foundation of a healthy marriage. Prophet ﷺ said, the girl who has never been married before should not be given in marriage until her permission has been sought. By who? The wali. So the wali just acts to discuss the mahr, and this is an honor for the queen of the day, the bride. It's not like demeaning her, but she has to accept the mahr. She has to say yes, and she's a pillar, one of the 4 pillars of the marriage contract. She has to accept. And this hadith, by the way, Bukhari, Muslim, is as authentic as the Quran. Number 2 is acts under duress in general in Islam, not only in marriage. Any sort of agreement are null and void. The Quran, oh, by the way, there's a verse in the Quran, chapter 24, Surah An-Nur, which discusses a lot of issues of hijab and women and relationship between men and women. Verse 33, Allah clearly says, do not force your daughters. So it's a clear verse. I'm wondering sometimes these cultural practices, they ignore everything that is in the Quran and do this in the name of the culture. So anyone, to summarize, anyone who conducts an Islamic marriage has the responsibility of ensuring that both the bride and groom give their free consent, and that they meet all the conditions of marriage, including, maturity, the freedom of choice, and all of that. And by the way, there is no duress in Islam, not only in marriage, also in divorce and others. So here is a problem, my brothers and sisters, and he was alluded to implicitly. Unfortunately, the guise of obeying parents, which is a great injustice, is done to many. Many people are told you have to obey your mother, and the mother gets upset and acts her act, or the father, and they know their daughter or their son, in many cases, doesn't want to marry whom they chose. Yet they say, don't you know that Islam says, second commandment after Allah come your parents? So under that, the abuse, which we call spiritual abuse, and then the person says, well, I don't want to go to hell for disobeying my parents. No. Prophet, peace be upon him. By the way, for your information, the first lawgiver and religion in general that spoke clearly, in clear terms, against forced marriages is Islam. And I challenge anybody to bring me a religion with a text that said clearly. And in the time, and maybe I should wrap up here, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, a girl came to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and she said, my father married me to his brother's son, meaning her cousin, so that he might raise his own status thereby. The Prophet ﷺ gave her the choice and said, I would approve of what your father did, but I also, he said, would you approve what your father did? And you have the right to refuse it. She said, look, I didn't choose him. My father chose him, and I approve him. I know him. I'm fine. But, O Rasulullah, she says, I wanted that women know that their fathers have no right to marry them against the will. And guess what? The Prophet ﷺ, he approved her. Look at this religion. So therefore, in Islamic law, it is haram for the guardian, the wali of the guardian, as we know, of the woman to force her to marry someone she does not want and she doesn't like. Like he cannot force her to eat something or not eat, or wear or not eat. So in a nutshell, and I close, forced marriages have no place in Islam because they are null and void in the law. The Quran clearly speaks against it. His Prophet, peace be upon him, more than once said they have to be asked and accept. And of course, the forced marriages, they deny females and males the right to exercise choice in life decisions, and this is a God-given right.
Thank you for that very clear stance, and one that challenges the misconception that equate cultural practices with religious obligations. So I'll turn back to Deepa. In your experience, what do you see as the key barriers preventing survivors from accessing justice? You did kind of mention most survivors coming into the country as sponsored spouses and losing or having that fear of losing that protection when seeking help. Are there any other barriers?
I mean, we did speak about the fear of retaliation, which could be retaliation against their own family members, it could be retaliation against themselves, and sometimes it could be retaliation of people who are left behind in the home country where they might have moved from. So that definitely is one of the biggest barriers I feel. Also, this form of violence, where it's the actors, the cast of characters of violence, are not people you don't know. It's not like a stranger committing a violence. It's people you know, people you love, people you depend on. So when it's your own community, and sometimes it could be your immediate family members, it becomes really hard to think about that if I come forward and I try to take help, the result of this could be that there will be actions taken against them. So that is another big barrier. And hence, from my perspective, the criminalization piece is not necessarily the real solution. It can be one of the tools in the toolbox, but it is not necessarily the solution for this form of violence. When it comes to other barriers, it is the lack of awareness, right? So, as we have heard from my colleagues and the co-panelists, that it is very clear what it should be, and we know where the misunderstanding comes from. And the misunderstanding comes from a lot of misogyny and misinterpretation of the cultural practices and the traditions. The history of these traditions is complicated. It is also complicated because we have to remember we are talking about people. It might sound a bit controversial, but people trying to do things to protect their own family members, right? So think about a war-torn country. Think about a forced migration situation where people are trying to leave a situation, and finding a spouse for your daughter was one way to maybe find a way of protection for her, or sending her off to Canada is probably one way to find protection. So I don't necessarily believe that we need to homogenize and criminalize everyone who participates in the practice. I think the solution lies in the education and understanding, as Hina was talking about, the long-term implications of these kind of practices. But I do believe that if there was a better cultural understanding and the contextual understanding of the coercion, which creates environment of this kind of violence and this kind of coercion for people to agree to these kind of marriages, there could be better solutions. Language, I think I spoke about in my keynote in the beginning, that language can be a huge barrier. And language can be also very elite thing, right? So in the communities where people speak English, but don't necessarily have the same level of expression. So I come from South Asia, that was not already apparent for a lot of you. And I have a lot of expression in my language, but because I come from a colonized country, right? It was colonized for over 250 years. So English was left behind and I learned English. But when I am experiencing pain and I have to express myself and I'm sitting in front of someone who speaks my language, I think that's the language I want to express my pain in rather than English, right? So the language of my love, the language of my pain, language of my grief is always going to be the language that where I'm most comfortable in expressing myself. And that is the piece that not a lot of people, the nuanced piece of the language that not many people want to understand or accept, that a lot of people who, even if they speak English, that does not mean that that's the language that they're going to speak sitting in front of a counselor, sitting in front of a lawyer or a police officer while expressing their pain. And the language, so what I suggest to a lot of people and practitioners is, and this is my offer to all of you, that even if you don't believe that you need an interpreter while talking to someone because they can speak in English, invite an interpreter in the room, because that can help you not only broker the language, but it can help you broker the culture. And that's definitely one of the pieces of barriers that can be removed. At the Schleifer Clinic, we have interpretation services available in over 170 languages. And I'm not doing a shameless plug of those services, but maybe I am doing a little bit, saying that, trauma-informed interpreters can really change people's experiences. And the last piece, which is really important to understand, is for a lot of young people who have come to understand that there is a stigma attached to the experiences in the community when you come forward and talk about what happens in my house. And there's discrimination and profiling that happens against them when they talk about their experiences. There is a huge barrier about it, right? We can't, unfortunately, it is really complicated to say I have a young child at home. It is really complicated for me to say to my young child, yes, you should have autonomy and agency, and you should be able to speak about your experiences. But she's also navigating a world where she's navigating an outside world which sees her in a specific way. It doesn't matter what her reality is. Two brown people can have completely different lived reality. But people outside world look at them and they imagine them all to be as one homogeneous group, right? And that challenge for young people is a barrier, whether we agree to it and we can agree to disagree on some of these issues. But from my perspective, the system problem has to be resolved at system level, and the community problem has to be resolved at the community problem level. We just cannot deny this on both ends. We cannot deny that we have challenges within our community to resolve, but we can also not deny that our young people feel that if they come out and talk about their experiences, they will be homogenized and discriminated against, and that continues to remain a barrier. I hope, I'm not necessarily upsetting anyone with my comments on that, because it is a bit of, agreeing to not agree kind of position to be in.
Oh, those are all like very difficult but important realities to address, right? So these are all important conversations. I'll go back to Hina. What are some common emotional or behavioral signs that someone may be experiencing coercion or preparing to enter a forced marriage?
Okay, so you want to first just understand that it's not obviously going to be apparent to you or to everyone else, but just that generally awareness of the community, knowing the people that are around you, people that are, a new bride that has come into the community and is being celebrated, or somebody new that you're in the neighborhood. So just that kind of that awareness of what's happening around, like just the alertness and the awareness. Traditionally, you won't see it happening from here within the communities, because I feel like there is a lot of education and a lot of people do learn and speak up and have the ability to say something or reach out to communities. Alhamdulillah, we're very blessed here. But I'm speaking in particular about the human trafficking that is done from third world countries where poverty is exploited and women are brought into the system as daughter-in-laws. And the community welcomes them in as like a new member, but then later on things progressively start getting worse and worse. So the first thing I think is just physical appearance. You can tell a lot by looking at a person and the changes over time. So being alert and aware of what that person looks like, what their demeanor is. Behavior is a big teller. Somebody who used to smile and used to be happy to see you now won't make eye contact, is a little bit skittish and a little bit more protective and shut down, and isn't really visible anymore, likes to stay indoors and doesn't come out a lot anymore. A lot of things about coercion, that you're being coerced into getting married, or you're not happy with the decision but you're being forced into saying yes, will be somebody who will have a tendency of being a people pleaser. So that responsibility of family honor, or I have to say yes because it's going to make my parents happy, or my parents know better, they know what they're talking about, or they know what they're doing. So just being aware of the language around that surrounds a person that is about to get married, and what you hear them saying, what their view of marriage is. Sometimes we can tell early on as well, even this was before somebody gets married. It's easy to tell because just of the way that their upbringing is, their view of marriage is, the way that it's been almost romanticized in their head, and a picture that's been painted. So essentially, besides just having that physical awareness, being able to see what that person is like seeing physical changes, behavior changes, and then just changes in the way that they communicate in regards to relationships, having a hard time saying no, the inability to decipher between what's right or wrong, and always wanting to get confirmation, like, oh, I need to go check with my partner, or I need to go check with somebody. I need to make sure it's okay for me to do this. Majority of the time, though, you will see, Layla, that people who are in a forced marriage situation, or somebody that is in a situation where they're being exploited while they're in a intimate partner relationship, is their loss of sense of self. It's less of them and more of everything else that is happening around them. And people generally in these circumstances learn to minimize themselves as individuals. So even if they are perhaps in a social setting, which they're not, majority of the time they're not as social, or they're not out and about in the community as much, but when they are, they're really minimized. You won't see them interacting like normal even. They'll be very quiet, very withdrawn. So just things like this to kind of keep an eye on. Having said that, not every introvert is, a victim of a coercion or a forced marriage or of human trafficking. So I just would exercise caution if you are concerned about somebody and you notice some, physical changes, behavioral changes, you notice oddity in the way that they are, or withdrawn, or anything of that nature. If you do notice that, the first and the most important thing to do is to build a connection with them, build a relationship with them. Don't try to do the detective work in your head that I went to a seminar and I heard something and this is it. This must be going on. Don't do that. Just make an effort to connect. There's a beautiful thing in Islam where we are supposed to be aware of our communities. We're supposed to be aware of our neighbors. We're supposed to be aware of the people that we are around. We're very alert religion, or a very awake religion. So just, take that away, and make sure that if you find somebody that falls under the same, categories that have been pointed out, to be able to reach out to that person and to check in on them, and then see, are they fearful? Are they afraid of looking? I don't know. I can't really talk right now. If you ask them for their phone number, let's make plans. I'd love to see you again. I don't have a phone. I don't know. I don't think my husband will be okay with this. I don't think my mother-in-law will be okay with this. Now you have reason to believe that there might be a concern. And in our profession, the rule of thumb is always err on the side of caution. If you have the early warning signs that something doesn't look right, that there might be, a forced marriage situation, or this might be something that doesn't sit right with me, and you do make the attempt to get to know them a little bit better, or you try to befriend them a little bit, and you notice a lot of resistance, then it's always great to reach out to organizations like Sakeenah Canada themselves. There's lots of wonderful work that's being done right here at home in the GTA, where you can reach out to an organization to get better guidance and get better support, and that can help you then narrow down the funnel to see, okay, who is actually a victim and could use help and support, versus somebody who just likes to stay quiet and mind their own business.
So I'm so glad you brought up community and like collectivism, which is so important to just like learn more about your neighbor who's around you. That's so important. Such an important point. I'll turn back to Dr. Salimi. I want to come back for a moment. How can faith leaders balance respecting cultural traditions with advocating for the rights and well-being of individuals, especially when it comes to forced marriage? I know you talked about how imams are starting to use the same brand as you, where you're starting to ask the bride and groom 3 times if they're in the forced marriage. Or do you have any kind of advice for religious leaders, or anything kind of tools for them to use?
Yeah, good question. But I just want to make a sort of disclaimer or notice. We have this impression that when we speak about the Muslim community, on the very last note you just commented on, is there really a Muslim community, as in the meaning of the word community, where there's communication and unity between different groups within that community? The answer, sadly, we have passed 2 million. We have 5% of the population. That's a significant number compared to the United States. Proportionally speaking, we are larger than the community in the United States. 5% is a very significant number of the population is Muslim, but we're not a community. And wherever I go, I never refer to our community in a singular form, and I refer to it as Muslim communities. Hence, highlighting this point explains the situation, unfortunately, of disunity and lack of communication. Sakeenah, you're doing a fantastic job, but unfortunately, you know very well, and I had discussion this with you guys and with the other groups, you can't cater for the communities. It's too much to chew in that little mouth. So that's the problem. For faith leaders, here is the question. Do they have access to the Muslim communities of Canada, where these forced marriages, whether education or practice, exist? Unfortunately, before we say that the faith leaders have a role, do we have the assurance that faith leaders have access? According to the Canadian Council of Imams, that the Muslim community, and I'll give you these numbers for the sake of studies, we have access only to 20% of the Muslim community. That's very shocking. And in Ramadan, we tend to have access to 60 to 70% of the Muslim community. So 40% is not involved, so we don't know them, they don't know us. We may see them in funerals and probably weddings. Within that 60% is actually in Ramadan. Then it goes down to 33% for the access of Jum'ah. So that faith leader can give a khutbah if this 33% of the Muslim community attends the prayers. And by the way, when we say 33%, that includes children and women and everyone, not the whole thing. And then these faith leaders, how can they reach? So there is a big problem here and a major schism between faith leadership and the source of teaching what Islam really teaches, or the true, or the, I wouldn't say true, but the correct cultures, and the people. So this is my major problem. So yes, social media is making things easy, but social media, they want us to do 1 minute short on Instagram. How can you teach anybody about forced marriages? People in general, you know very well, don't have the desire or the attention span to listen to a message about these things. Are there in a subtle environment where people learn. So if we're talking about the 20%, yes, I think we did a study not too long ago. Who was doing that study? I don't recall, was it CCMW or one of the women federations? And they actually found that the communities that, or the people, individuals who are attached to their local communities have less divorce problems. I mean, divorce is not something wrong with it, it's a solution. But I mean, dispute that lead to sometimes divorce or violence, and have less problems with parenting, because they have this support that replaced the village, and they go and talk about it. And people, even when they want to get married, they would consult not only the family, maybe very often I have couples coming to see me before they want to decide to get married, or the family says, what do you think? And this, help us, we don't know how to make a choice. So that's basically very much, and this is very common, and I'm most of the audience here is women. A lot of young girls now, they want to marry outside their own culture. They're even outside their own ethnic group in the Muslim community. But the parents, 75%, they don't want. They want Desi husband for their daughter, and the Arabs or Palestinian, whatever they're Middle Eastern, they want from their culture. Only a minority of 25% is open-minded. They don't mind marrying outside the ethnic group. So we're talking about different communities and different problems. So faith leaders can, through teaching, through example, through things like I said during the nikah itself. I use the nikah to teach those who are present. It's not only by the bride, about the bride and the groom, but also send a message. And I would say one of my lines for those girls born here, God, and I say this so they can hear it, and their parents, Islam is not against you, it's for you. You have the right to choose. Not even your parents can force you. I say this message because you have 200 people sitting there. It's an opportunity for me to teach. So I would say faith leaders seize every opportunity possible. Social media, weddings, whatever is the situation, an incident that's bad, to make the point, these forced marriages never lead to good things. And as mentioned by Hina, depression, especially we are in the season of depression now. Depression is an anxiety, all these mental health problems, they are actually the outcome of people not finding what they wanted. They're not finding what Allah says, peace and solace in the marriage, having that house or that home, like your oasis of peace. You're happy with your partner, but rather you're just looking, this is my destiny, I have to deal with it, I'm just waiting for death, and maybe we'll go to Jannah for my patients. Unfortunately, this is the reality. So seize every single opportunity, consultation, teach the right thing, and like I say, bit by bit and brick by brick. And I'm very optimistic, by the way, although I sound pessimistic. The young are rebelling against these cultural norms, which are not supposed to be norms. And they're going back to Islam more than they challenging their parents with Islam. Oh, Imam said, the Quran says, the Hadith says, and then the parents sometimes come to me, why are our children talking like this? Well, if Prophet Muhammad was here, he would take their side for sure.
Thank you for that powerful message. I'll move over to Deepa. In light of these challenges, how can we improve legal awareness and access to justice for those who are most vulnerable to forced marriage? You did talk about kind of that federal component, but also the community component. Are there any practical kind of tools you could give?
Most definitely. I think one of the pieces that, in terms of, how can we improve the legal response, is definitely related to what we are doing right now, which is a multi-sectoral approach to understanding the issues and a very complex and layered approach to understanding the problem. I'm a big fan of an author from South Asia, and she says that we should never simplify a complex problem, and we should not complicate a simple problem. So I always remind myself of that, right? Like, where are we complicating it, and where can we simplify it? It's an interdisciplinary approach to education and awareness around the legal rights of available to people is definitely one of those pieces. But then there is also the piece around when is a good time to approach law and understanding your legal rights. So getting independent legal advice, talking to a lawyer, talking to someone who's really well educated before you start a process. So one of the challenges that I faced with a lot of people who approach enforcement agencies or who call 911, what they when they do it without having a full understanding of what those processes mean for themselves. And the tragedy of that situation could lead to that, their outcome and the goal that they thought they'll be able to achieve is not achieved because the system is not really necessarily designed perfectly for every situation. So I say that as long as we can come up with education materials which gives people a good sense of what their rights are, and then resources to get that independent legal advice before they start a process, that can be super helpful in terms of the legal response to the problem. And then it boils down to how aware we are in these multidisciplinary practices about those legal rights. Are we aware of the phone numbers that people should have handy? Are we keeping materials around exit planning and how to prevent this kind of trafficking situation for yourself or forced marriage situation for yourself if you are anticipating a travel? What are the ways to keep yourself safe? What should be you doing about your passport, and where is your passport, and who has it? Who can you call? What are the numbers that you can call if you're stuck abroad in a situation? There are all these amazing resources that should be handily available to all of us to give out to the survivors when we are working with them. And lastly, I think this is something, because I do trauma-informed lawyering. From that perspective, I want to remind ourselves that sometimes law is one of the options, but it is not the option that your client is necessarily looking for. Your client is looking for the violence to stop from their lives. They're looking for safety, and they're looking for a solution. And law doesn't necessarily provide them with those options. And if that is the situation, then you have to be, in my world, you need to be strategic. You need to be thinking about feminist advocacy. You need to be thinking about what is the goal of this person. That's why I talked about client-centric approach. I do not suggest any lawyers in the room or any practitioners in the room to think about, I now know what women need to do. Because that's where you start making the biggest mistake as a practitioner. You need to actually surrender and believe that the women are the experts of their situation. You need to give them a buffet of choices, let them choose, and walk the walk with them instead of making choices for them. I was laughing when Hina was saying, don't listen to this webinar and then go, and look at every situation as a possible forced marriage situation. I was like, so true, because this is a real life experience that I'm sharing with all of you, that I received a call once from someone very well-meaning saying to me, I was at a hairdresser's and I was overhearing two people talk about a situation. And I think there is a flight that is going out tonight where a woman is being taken out of the country for forced marriage situation. It was such a vague, long-winded story. And I was really respecting this person's relaying the message to me. But at the same time, I was like, hearsay. You didn't meet the person. You didn't see what was going on. You don't know who this person is. You're just listening to two people talking about the situation. You have come to the conclusion that there is a forced marriage happening and someone is going out of the country. Lots of people are going out of the country every day. And I'm not saying that some of them are not being taken abroad without their choice, but making those assumptions is dangerous. But understanding about forced marriage is not complicated. That's where the simple piece is. There are lots of amazing resources available. If you want to look at what is the movement of, against forced marriage globally, you can put a Google alert for yourself and get stories on forced marriage on a daily basis. You can join social media mutual aid groups to support young women who are navigating these situations. And you can cross collaborate. Like, I can work with Hina can work with me, and we can make sure, and we can get, our Dr. Salim's help when we need a family to be educated. So we can all cross collaborate and work with each other in providing support to women who want to get support. Please do not use a rescue mentality, because that can be extremely dangerous. And people who get into that rescue mentality can cause more harm than good. And please, that's why, if I can say one thing emphatically, doing this work for over 20 years, is that I don't want us to think that we are saviors, because that's a dangerous thing to think about. If you want to be an ally and you want to walk the walk with them and you want to be their witness, and you want to make sure that they are ready for the fight that they need to fight, and then you're doing the right thing.
Well, speaking of cost-sectoral approach, I'll move over to Hina. This will be the last question until we move over to audience questions. Can you share some examples of culturally sensitive approaches to therapy that have been effective for survivors of forced marriage? I'm sure a lot of frontline workers on the chat would love to know some tools to use.
Okay, well, this is wonderful, because Deepa gave me a really nice runway to take this forward on. It has to be a client-centered approach. I love how she mentioned that we're not the saviors. And even as practitioners, as social workers, mental health care providers, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, we're not coming from a place of privilege and I know it all, so let me help you and let me tell you what you need. Especially when it comes for victims of human trafficking, forced marriages, you have to give them their power back. They already had it. You just have to help them refine it. And when you work with that approach, that I'm going to give you your autonomy, initially you're going to find a person with like a deer in headlights. what does that mean? I don't have autonomy. I'm not allowed to say anything. And so really just being an ally, being a support system, and helping them understand that this is a process that will take time, but you have to come into your own light. Now, right off the bat, PTSD counseling, post-traumatic stress disorder, you're going to have to work with a lot of trauma-informed work, whether it has to do with financial trauma, physical trauma, psychological trauma. There's going to be a lot of those. You have to peel away those layers very slowly. There has to be an integration of respect for religious values, cultural values, family sensitivity. So probably taking a systems approach where you're not just focusing on one thing, but the most important thing to remember that the best kind of counseling, the best kind of therapy in these circumstances is coming from an empowerment and strength-based approach, where all that power needs to return back to the person who has been walking through this, living through this, experiencing all of it, and then for them to be able to understand what they are given, the rights that they've been given, whether they're religious rights, cultural rights, society rights, the rights that they have, being able to help them understand, helping inform them, helping them come into their own story. One of the approaches that I've found that has been really helpful and really supportive is narrative therapy. The way that Deepa described it, that every client has their own story. We talked about case studies and examples, and we want to do broad strokes, right? Like everybody's gone through the same thing. Oh, everybody must have gone through sexual exploitation, or everyone must have experienced abuse. But narrative therapy is actually a way of letting a person tell their story, and for the therapist to then pick up on the nuances and the challenges of that individual and helping empower them through it. So it actually turns out to be a beautiful story of growth, of learning, of development, and then freedom from what you were being held back on before, so that you can kind of say that I got myself through this, that I've got clients in the past who've because of the way that they were in situations that they were in, will say, oh, thank you so much, you saved me, and oh, this has been, you've brought me out of this horrible situation. And as therapists, we're trained to give it right back to them and to say, no, you helped yourself, you got yourself through this, you did all the hard work, you came and you told your story beautifully. And it's very overwhelming initially for that client to hear that I did this. Oh my goodness, I helped myself, I got myself through it. But it has such a beautiful outcome when you allow that person to really take their own story, turn things around, and benefit from, and I know I say this carefully, it is a very controversial thing to say, but benefit from the hardship that they had gone through. Because at the end of the day, it's all about life's journey and growth and experiences, and the tests that we go through are intended with reason and purpose to bring us closer to that which is best for us. So that piece of, empowerment, client-centered counseling, trauma-informed counseling, and then of course a systemic or a systems-based approach that you're addressing it all based on what the client's individual needs are.
Right. Thank you so much, Hina. We just got a quick question for Dr. Salimi. I know he's leaving in like 4 minutes, so I'll just ask that question. It says, can you please clarify this? And I believe they put in an ayah. My understanding of this ayah is that it prohibits forcing slave girls into prostitution. Could you please clarify this relating to force one's daughter into marriage? My understanding is that it's 2 different things.
It's a good question. There are 2 ways to read it. You want to go literal? Yes, it was about those who own slaves, and they would unfortunately be part of their prostitution ring, which was a fact even in the time of Prophet ﷺ. So as part of Surah An-Nur was about polishing the behavior of people and removing some of the cultural practices, because a slave girl, unfortunately at that time slavery was a reality. They were forced against their will. Now that they are believers and followers of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, they refused. So that was for slave girls. How about, so scholars say if that verse was meant to purify society and even those who were owned, and although that's a different topic, Islam encouraged freeing them, and which eventually happened over the centuries. How about forcing your own daughter against her will to marry someone? So what we call implicit laws and explicit. Explicitly, it talks about the act of forcing. So you could read the verse, do not force your daughters, although here could be also interpretation, the official interpretation, your slave girls, but there's no more slavery. Do not force. The act of forcing came vehemently here in prohibition. Do not force. So if that is said about those who are not your own daughters, how about your own daughters? As we said, the other verses and the teachings of Prophet, peace be upon him, interpreting such verses is that you do not force them. And if the girl sees that the choice of the parents, which we refer to as arranged marriage, is fine with her, and that's where the disagreement whether forced marriages are null and void and they automatically lead to divorce, and if there is a child, is a child considered a legitimate child or not, or is considered like other acts. This is where the two different things can collide. But in general, we should have the what we call general reading of the verse, that the act of forcing someone is vehemently prohibited in Islam. That's the reason why I quoted that verse. Thank you. And I'm sorry I have to leave, Layla. All the best, inshallah, and I'll stay logged in, but I have to go for salat. Assalamu alaikum.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Jazakallah khair. So we do have another question. This is from Tanisha. Do you have advice on how private sector entities that may be unwittingly facilitating human trafficking could better support your efforts?
Very quickly say this to everyone in the room, and I say it with a lot of compassion and love, so please take it with that background. We support a lot of businesses who in front of our eyes are doing human trafficking, and at times we do it because we want cheap food, or we want cheap labor, or we want cheap clothes. So it's really important when you're working within your communities and you're benefiting from those businesses that you be curious and you hold people accountable and asking if you're able to get a dress made for a cheaper price, if you're able to buy, I'd say $1 for 2 samosas. I know it is probably not $1 anymore, but it is $1.50 for 2. But that is not possible without someone getting exploited in the food chain, right? So from my perspective, when it comes to us as social, as the citizens, I think we need to be really aware of which businesses are we supporting. And for businesses which are working within our communities, I think we need to work with them and help them be accountable. I think it is calling in the businesses and talking about, if you are working with a woman who you're paying, lower than minimum wage, who is this woman? Where is this money going? Is she being really supported by you while she's providing these services? And so, I mean, I don't want to go into the walking the dirty laundry kind of thing about the communities, because, I really like Dr. Salim's intervention that we are talking about communities. We should ourselves also be very aware that there are many different types of communities that we are talking about here. And it is really important that we call people out, but we call people in. And we make ourselves accountable as we engage with the private sector. But the private sector has a huge role to play in stopping these exploitative practices.
Thank you for that. We have another question. What role does language and terminology play in how forced marriage and trafficking are understood and addressed?
I think Deepa kind of spoke about this a little bit earlier as well, but I can take that one. I think that and I'm going to take this completely from a therapist perspective, is we've got to be careful with the language that we use. Remember, it's a different conversation when you're speaking clinically in a setting or a seminar or a course or a class, or you're learning about forced marriages and human trafficking. It's a very different language set when you are talking to somebody who's actually experiencing it or going through it. When you are approaching somebody who you have concerns about, the language has to be very delicate, and it has to be person-centered. You know, what's going on with you? You tell me, how are you feeling? Let them come up with the language rather than feeding, you know, labels and terminology. It's so important to get that comfort going with people who are experiencing human trafficking or forced marriages. The most important thing is for them to know that they have an ally, that they have a support system. And the best language that an ally speaks is the same language you speak. If you are looking to listen to somebody, you know, trying to listen to somebody for concerns, or, you know, just say that, okay, I want to be supportive, then allow them to tell you what their experiences are. And when, you know, I mean, I've had people very aggressively, and Deepa, you've seen it as well, very quick to label, this is a very abusive situation, your husband is financially abusing you, your mother-in-law is exploiting you. And okay, probably you're right, those are probably the clinical terms that people would use, but who wants to hear that about themselves? Who wants to be at the face of, oh my God, I'm that person? I'm going to share a small tidbit and then we can move on to the next question. I actually did a seminar at a university about marriage, and the room was filled with 100 women, young girls. They're all university students. And so I asked them, and it was about, the topic was about abuse in marriage or lack of consent and so on and so forth. And so I asked them, I said to them, how many of you would report if you were abused in a relationship? Like how many of you would come forth and report it? And you had these 19, 20, 21-year-olds, everybody's hand goes up. Like they fire their hand up right away. Now, anybody who's working for Sakeenah or anybody who's working in the field will tell you who reports the first incident? Nobody. Nobody. You're groomed into this. You're groomed into circumstances that are exploitative. So just to be able to fix our own language, that when you are working with somebody or talking to somebody or dealing with somebody that's going through something, words matter. You know, they've been through a lot. Your words are going to matter. So terminology plays a very important role, but I want to say it from the other perspective. Don't try to come up with the fancy words. Talk woman to woman, person to person. Keep it simple, because that's where hearts connect. And when a person feels safe with you, they're more likely to be able to seek out help, because they're not gonna, it takes a long time for women to actually, for most cases, it actually takes somebody else to tell them that, hey, you might want to take a look at what's happening in your life. This doesn't sound right. But the softer the language, the easier to understand, especially when it comes to language barriers. Like if it's the same language, these things go the distance, and they make such a huge difference in helping somebody come to help rather than, kind of shy into their own selves.
So much, Tina. Another question kind of related to that. How can therapists navigate situations where family members are actively opposed to the survivor seeking mental health support? So there's, I guess, two types of stigma here.
I'll take this, Deepa. Is that okay?
Yes,
Okay. I have a little poster in my, like a little frame in my office that says that people are in therapy because of the people who don't go to therapy. Why would anybody who is exploiting you, hurting you, or abusing you at any level want you to get help? It breaks their system, doesn't it? It kind of takes their power away from them. So why would they ever want? Of course, they're going to be opposed to you getting help. But here's where I say that, look up from your phones and look around you. Look around in your communities, look around in your neighborhoods, so that you know who the people are that live around in your, live around your neighborhoods and in the schools where your children go to, and so on and so forth. Just be aware and alert of the people that are there, because you will learn a lot more about their challenges and their problems. And then when it says, like as a therapist, well, how do you navigate it? First and foremost, we're at a duty to warn. So the minute you sense harm, the minute you recognize, okay, this does not look like a great situation. If you are a practitioner here, you can always call your regional non-emergent police line for help. I've had incidents early on in my career where I'm scratching my head wondering, is this reportable or isn't this reportable? And so coworkers, non-emergent police line, these are all great resources where you can ask, okay, what do I do in this particular situation? The family is never going to be in support of the person seeking help. That's probably the reason why they're struggling in the first place. But as an outsider, when you're able to identify that this doesn't look right, then you can be the source that opens up the door to help. And sometimes that looks like offering offering your phone to make a phone call to a therapist or a phone call to a resource provider, because you'd be amazed, right? Like people who are in these situations, I say that, you know, number one, like a lot of them won't have a phone or access to a phone, but even if they do, their phone is monitored very strictly. So just even offering your phone and saying, hey, listen, do you want to make a call or speak to my friend who can guide you or help you or support you? These are ways. But yeah, if you think that, you know, how do you navigate family members that oppose you, the person getting help, they will not want the person to get help. So you have to help the person and not worry so much about the environment that they're in or the people that they're around.
Can I very quickly add something that a lot of times family members are opposed to the idea of two reasons. One, that Hina pointed out, that the power and control, because they will lose their control. But there is also a deep-seated issues in some of our communities where mental health support is seen as if something is inherently wrong with you. And there is a deep stigma attached to mental health supports. And a lot of brown people and Black people are opposed to the idea of counseling, because counseling as a modality has its roots in Eurocentric way of doing things, right? So, and that Eurocentric way has been very harmful for the communities at times. So I mean, I'm coming at it from a different angle, which is around the psychoeducation of what the mental health support can do. And if you can start with that education piece for the person in front of you, because again, remember what we are saying, both me and Hina are agreeing on the piece that the person in front of you is the person who needs the empowerment and who needs the support. So if you can start with the education around what does mental health support mean, what kind of mental health support are you talking about, what is the benefit? So you're giving them the tools that they need for advocating for themselves. So believe them, trust them when someone says, I'm hurting and I need mental health support, the biggest thing that you need to do is you need to say, I believe you 110% that you need that support. That's where their healing is starting. Believe me, if you believe them, if you tell them that what you're saying is actually, I agree with you that this is happening, that's one validation that they need. And that's their first, that's their step towards the journey. And then rest of it, it can go in both modalities. It can go where Hina is saying, support this person, forget about the family, or maybe the family will also come on a journey of psychoeducation and understand. So, it can work out in both ways, but the piece is that if someone does a disclosure, please tell them that whatever they're going through is absolutely right. Because the worst that we do is sometimes when we question people and say, is it really so? Because as if we are trained psychotherapists or counselors, and what that does is that creates a sense of gaslighting. It takes a lot of effort for people to actually come forward and say, I'm hurting. And if someone says, I'm hurting, and you tell them, are you really? You have killed their spirit with that one sentence. So if you cannot do that, and if you don't understand how to do it, call Hina. but please start with the validation of their experience.
Awesome. Thank you both, and Dr. Salimi, who's currently praying, for such an insightful conversation and all your expertise. I'm just going to pass over the microphone to Samaya, since we are close to the end.
Yes, thank you so much to all of our panelists, Deepa, Hina, and Dr. Salimi, for sharing all your expertise, your perspectives on this critical and very nuanced issue. Part of Sakeenah's anti-human trafficking program is prevention and awareness, and that's why we do these webinars, to highlight these issues that are taking place, and also to take the conversation further back to our communities, for all of us, the rest of you, to partake in the awareness piece. So please continue having these conversations within your communities, within your homes. It's only through these conversations that change can take place. So thank you very much for being here, for listening and committing to the cause. Hope everyone has a great evening. Assalamu alaikum. Good night.